Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we will be taking a dark and chilling journey through the world of serial killers. These individuals have committed horrific crimes, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Get ready to learn about the 12 most notorious serial killers in the world. Ted Bundy. Starting off our list, we have Ted Bundy, is considered to be one of America's most notorious serial killers. He confessed to killing more than 30 women in the 1970s and was eventually executed in 1989. Jeffrey Dahmer. Next up, we have Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys and was sentenced to 15 life terms in 1992. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was the leader of a cult known as the Manson family, who committed a series of 9 murders in the late 1960s. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1981 and remains in prison to this day. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a notorious serial killer who murdered 33 young men and boys in the 1970s. He was sentenced to death in 1980 and executed in 1994. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper, also known as the Cold Killer, murdered 10 people, including his own mother, in the 1970s. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1973 and is still serving his sentence. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was a notorious serial killer who murdered 14 people in the 1980s. He was sentenced to death in 1989 and died in prison in 2013. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a notorious female serial killer who murdered 7 men in Florida in the early 1990s. She was sentenced to death in 1992 and executed in 2002. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 52 women and children in the 1980s and 1990s. He was sentenced to death in 1992 and executed in 1994. Peter Sutcliffe. Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, murdered 13 women and attempted to murder 7 others in England in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1981 and remains in prison to this day. Rodney Alcala. Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer, was a notorious serial killer who murdered at least 8 women in the 1970s. He was sentenced to death in 2010 and remains on death row. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, was a British physician who murdered at least 115 of his patients in the 1990s. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2000 and committed suicide in 2004. Jack the Rip. Finally, we have Jack the Ripper, one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Jack the Ripper murdered at least 5 women in the East End of London in 1988, and his identity remains a mystery to this day. And that concludes our journey through the world of serial killers. These individuals have committed horrific crimes, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. We hope that this video has shed some light on the dark and chilling world of serial killers.